I would like to begin today by reminding us about this sandwich construction, which is the second sandwich construction in the Gospel of Mark. The first was in chapter 3, verses 21 and 22, the family of Jesus, and then continuing with the Beelzebul controversy, and once again completing the true family. Here in chapter 5, verses 21 to 24, we will be introduced to the fact that Jairus' daughter is at the point of death, and once Jesus begins going with him, then the story will be interrupted. Another story will be completed of the woman with the flow of blood, and then once again the story about Jairus' daughter, who by now has died, will be continued and completed. So this is the first part of the sandwich construction, in which Jesus is told about the fact that Jairus' daughter is at the point of death. Jesus crosses over now to the other side, where he had just healed the Gerasene demoniac. And so this verse connects what happened to what is going to happen now. What happened was that Jesus has cured a Gerasene demoniac from the legion of demons and shown himself to be powerful, even more powerful than earlier, when he was able to exorcise very easily one demon who possessed a man at the beginning of the gospel. The sea once again is mentioned, as are the crowds who are coming to Jesus. So Mark wants to indicate his popularity. He shows the popularity of Jesus by the mention of the crowds at various times in his gospel. Jairus is one of the presidents of the synagogue. It was an elected position, and it was really a highly regarded position. There are two people in the Gospel of Mark who fall at the feet of Jesus. One is Jairus, as we can see here, and another is the Syrophoenician woman later in chapter 7, verses 24 to 30. Falling at the feet is both an indication that one knows that what one is requesting can be granted. So I am really assuming an inferior position when I fall at the feet of somebody, and also when I'm falling at the feet, the person who sees me, the person whom I'm requesting for that favor, will realize that it is an urgent situation. This falling at the feet here also seems to be strategic by Mark to display that urgency, because he wants Jesus to rush to save Jairus' daughter, because very clearly Jairus' daughter is not merely sick. She is not merely lying in bed with a fever like Simon's mother-in-law. It is not really a possession. No, very clearly the words of Jairus are, come and lay your hands on her that she may live. She is at the point of death. So very clearly, just a few more moments or a few more hours and she will be gone. So lay your hands on her is basically awareness that Jesus has healed in the past, and that healing is requested now. At the moment, we are not aware whether and if Jesus can raise the dead. We only know that up to now, he has been shown as a very, very powerful healer and a very, very powerful exorcist. So the request of Jairus is that even as she is at the point of death, that Jesus must come and convey this healing touch. And in the last verse, before Mark can interrupt this story, a large crowd is going behind Jesus. And so Mark will say in verse 24, Jesus began to go with him. And we are happy when Jesus starts walking, because when the story continues, we assume that when Mark says Jesus began to go with him, we assume that Jesus will arrive on time and he will save the girl from death. However, Mark very beautifully, as the mystery novelist that he is, interrupts the story. And we notice he interrupts the story for 10 whole verses. From chapter 5, verse 25 to 34, the story is interrupted by Mark, and Mark introduces now another story altogether. In this story, Mark tells us about the woman's ailment. She suffered from hemorrhages. He tells us the number of years that she suffered. He also tells us that she had endured much under many physicians. He also says that she was no better, but rather grew worse. And our response would be, Mark, what happened to Jairus' daughter? What happened to Jairus' daughter? And notice, Mark will be quite comfortable and calm and serene. He will say, she had heard about Jesus. She came up behind him. He will give us everything, not only what is happening outside, but also what is happening in the mind of Jesus, in the mind of the woman. So we see the woman is saying to her, notice, she says to her, if I but touch his clothes. In other words, very, very clearly, the woman is saying, if I but touch his clothes. So she had faith even before she made the touch. This is also what Mark wants to indicate. And later, when the woman is identified, or rather the woman identifies herself, there is also another reason for Mark trying to do that, because he did not want to convey the impression of this magic touch of the cloak. What is required is, the woman's faith is required. If I but touch his clothes, so she said this to herself, she has got faith, and then she goes ahead with what is being done. However, our intention is that Mark should hurry up, that Jesus should hurry up. He has begun going, and the woman's plight is described in great detail. Notice, Mark takes 3 verses just to describe this whole scene, the inner dialogue, the inner monologue that she is having with herself, and all of these things. And because of her faith, she says, I will be healed. This is what happens. The cure is instantaneous, and a woman who suffered for 12 years, a woman who had gone to so many physicians, a woman who had spent so much of money, is now cured in an instant. And then begins the dialogue. So Jesus is aware that something has happened, and the dialogue becomes the focal point. Now, the perception corresponds to the woman's exception. In other words, the fact that there is something mighty which has happened, and the evangelists avoid using the word miraculous, and they prefer this mighty work of power, dunamis. So dunamis is a mighty work of power. It's an act of power. It's something which is strong. And so the disciples respond logically, and they really wonder what Jesus is talking about, though Jesus is talking about something deep. The disciples interpret the question of Jesus, who touched me, on the surface level, namely to give what will seem and is a very, very logical answer. There is a huge crowd, and so many people are touching you. So what do you mean by who touched you? And in the meantime, we are worried about Jairus' daughter. So you see the delay which Mark causes, not only by giving us the story in between, but also with the attitude of Jesus. And we are prompted to tell Jesus, Jesus, please rush to save the girl. Jesus, why are you delaying? Just somebody did touch you. The woman was healed. Now let's move on. Let's move forward. But Jesus will not. And so the search leads to the woman coming forward. And there are some who say that because the woman would possibly have thought that others would consider her unclean, she did not come forward. And that's why she was scared that her touch of Jesus would have made Jesus unclean. As we saw in the case of the leper, being an external religion, this was a large challenge and a large problem. The woman was frightened, as I said, because of this impurity, which she thought she would have communicated. And so also she did not come forward because really she was stunned in a certain sense with the fact that she was healed. However, her courage and her honesty led her to come forward, and Jesus responds to her already in the address. When he calls her daughter, the address is so that the woman should already have this idea that she is not going to be faulted, that no matter what happens, she is going to be accepted. That's why the address daughter is important. And the fact that Jesus has to once again intervene is also, as I said earlier on, to avoid the understanding that only this magical touch can save. Peace basically means here wholeness. The Greek word for peace is eirene, and the Hebrew word for peace is shalom. And therefore, when Jesus says go in peace, he's communicating. He's not wishing, but he's granting what you might say an wholeness. And the woman once again is now able to restore herself also in her own mind back to society. It is likely that she did not think that she should be isolated because nobody could see that internal hemorrhage. But she was aware of it, and she would have, in her mind, in her heart, felt that she was defiled. And that would have been a challenge for her, which now she has overcome. And what is interesting to notice, and only Mark narrates this as a sandwich construction, and he does it so beautifully. So Mark narrates this as a sandwich construction, and we see while he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, your daughter is dead. And we are tempted to say, Jesus, could you not have rushed to save the girl? And what we notice is this, that those who come say to Jairus, why trouble the teacher any further? This kind of question, or rather which is a rhetorical question, in other words, they are saying, not asking a question, they say, don't trouble the teacher any further. And the reason is because they have put a limit already. So those who came from the leader's house have put a limit as to what Jesus can do and what Jesus cannot do. And this is the limit which they have put. And so therefore, what is important to understand is that they have put this limit. Jesus, however, will not be restricted. Notice here, if we saw earlier on, at the miracle of the storm on the lake, there was a link between fear and belief. Because the disciples were frightened, they could not believe. Here, Jesus links up the two once again when he says, if there is fear, you will not be able to believe. And so he tells Jairus, do not fear, only believe. And so Jairus has to decide whether he will understand what Jesus is saying. And so those from the house of Jairus come there and act in a way as people who will put a stop to the miracle. And now the question in our mind is it possible when this limit has been put, and it seems logical, does Jesus also have the power to raise the dead? Jesus is an exorcist. He can exorcise even a legion of demons. Jesus is a healer. He can heal even a woman who was sick for 12 years. But can Jesus raise the dead? This is the question we ask. For the first time, and two others later, Jesus takes the three with him. These are considered as the three chosen ones. He takes them with him, Peter, James, and John. The second time will be at the Transfiguration, and the third time will be in Gethsemane. The fact that there is a commotion would indicate that the girl had just died. Now, even though Mark does not give us the details, Matthew gives us the detail, because in Matthew's narrative, the girl is already dead. When the official comes, the official is not named in Matthew, but when the official comes to Jesus, the girl is already dead. So there is no suspense in the Gospel of Matthew. In Mark, when Jesus comes to the house along with Jairus, the commotion would indicate very clearly that the girl had died. And those who were in the crowd would have been the mourners, and would have been those who were employed, the flute players and a woman, to sing or to chant mournful dirges to say that the person has gone. There would also be, because Jairus was a rich man, other percussion instruments. The crowd would have them. Jesus has not gone into Jairus' house. He has not seen how the girl is. He has only got reports from Jairus earlier that his daughter was at the point of death, and he has got reports from the people who come from Jairus' house that the girl is dead. So very clearly, there are two indications that the girl is dead. First, that the ones who come from the leader's house communicate this clearly to the leader, and Jesus hears it. That's why he responds by saying, "Fear not, only believe." Second, when he comes to the house, he sees this crowd who would only be there if the girl was dead. The response of Jesus, therefore, is not a response which shows that he knows what is happening. It is a response of faith. In other words, what Jesus said to Jairus, he practices himself. What Jesus says to Jairus, he practices himself. And this is shown in his response to the crowd when he tells them that the girl is only sleeping. Notice that the girl is only sleeping, she is not dead. So it is not that Jesus means the girl is unconscious, or the girl is semi-conscious, or the girl is in a coma. No, it does not mean that. It means that the girl is dead, because at least from the external signs, but that Jesus will raise the girl. That is the understanding. And the response, and it is an understandable response, they laughed at him because, once again, they interpret the statement of Jesus on the surface level. Meaning, if we have been invited, then it is very clear that there is a death and not sleeping. And so therefore, even though this is their response and it is like a logical response, they were put out because this is not a time for mourning. And while earlier it was the woman who touched Jesus, the request of Jairus was, "Come and lay your hands on her and she will live." Now, there is no need to lay the hands, but there is the need to take the hand. This is one of the miracles in which Aramaic words are used, talitha kum, and it effects the healing. So no external methods except the action of taking the girl by the hand and lifting her up and telling her to get up in Aramaic. The number 12 seems to be a significant number here because Mark mentions at the beginning of the second story, which he interprets, which he puts in between the Jairus' daughter being at the point of death and dying. He tells us at the beginning of the woman with the flow of blood that she was ill for 12 years. And now later, at the end of the story, he tells us about the 12. And there are two commands given. The command to give the girl something to eat, while on the surface level, is interpreted as the concern of Jesus. It is also to be interpreted as a preparation for what is going to come. That the people are going to be fed and the people are going to eat soon in Mark's miracle. However, the first command is a very strange command. And the reason why it is strange is because very clearly those outside would know that the girl is dead. It was very likely that some of the crowd had been invited by the family of Jairus in order to come and mourn, as was usually the case. There were professional mourners who were invited to come and mourn at the funeral. So very likely they knew that the girl was dead. Otherwise, they wouldn't be invited. Otherwise, somebody would not pay them for their services. So this command to silence also, when the outsiders knew, and it's likely when Mark uses the word crowd, there could have been many people around, not only those who were the professional mourners, but others also could be there. So how is it possible that this can be kept silent? Now, some will say that Jairus and his wife were told, tell them that the girl was not dead, she was only unconscious, which is not the case because the text does not say that. The text is telling us that Jesus very, very clearly commands them to silence and tells them not to tell anyone about it. That is the meaning of the command to silence. And Mark deliberately has this command to silence here to indicate to us the absurdity and to tell us that we must look beyond the mere surface level of the command to silence. What does it mean to look beyond the surface level? It means not to even interpret Jesus as someone who can raise from the dead. That is the true meaning of the command to silence here. So on the surface level, anyone who hears Jesus tell Jairus and possibly his wife and the three disciples whom he has taken with him, Peter, James, and John, don't tell anyone about this, would laugh at this command to silence. And that's what Mark wants us to do. He wants us to laugh. But then, after we have finished laughing, when we go deeper into it and wonder why Mark has the command to silence here, we realize that if earlier Jesus commands the demons to silence because he did not want to be known through the lips of demons, and so not simply as an exorcist. Later he commands the leper not to tell anyone about it, so he wanted to be known not merely as somebody who could cure leprosy or who could heal. And now, even though he can raise from the dead, he does not even want to be known as someone who can raise from the dead. So this is the reason for the command to silence here. When we look at these miracles in a summary form, we can see them having some similarities and other differences. While the girl is 12 years old, the woman has suffered for 12 years. The girl, obviously, because she is at the point of death, would be in the house. The woman is outside in the crowd. Here, in the case of the girl, it is Jesus who takes her by the hand and lifts her up. In the case of the woman, it is she who touches Jesus, not Jesus who touches her. The girl, obviously, being at the point of death and later dying, cannot be seen to have faith, at least here. The girl's father has faith and the woman has faith. There is no command to silence to the woman because she is outside in the crowd. Even though there are outsiders who have come to mourn, there is the command to silence because Jesus does not want to be known merely as somebody who could raise from the dead. Elijah and Elisha also performed healings, but they are quite different from the manner in which Mark narrates this. We come now to the last part of the second chapter, which is conflict. The parts of our chapter were summary, which began with the summary of the activities of Jesus in chapter 3, verses 7 to 12, something connected with the disciples, namely the choice and the naming, and then we were introduced to the broad part of the kingdom, which here comes with a lot of challenges, comes with a lot of difficulties, comes with struggle, and the last part of this chapter is the conflict. And the conflict here is created by the townspeople. In an earlier lecture, I said that the term which they use for him is a derogatory term, is a negative term, and I will explain why I said that now when we come to these verses. The hometown here is not named, but in chapter 1, verse 9, we were told that Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee. In chapter 1, verse 24, the first miracle and exorcism, the demons identify Jesus as Jesus of Nazareth. And so Mark takes for granted that those who are reading his gospel will know that Jesus is from Nazareth. And so he does not mention the name of the hometown here. On the Sabbath day, Jesus teaches in the synagogue. And his teaching is so authoritative that those who listen tend to ask questions. 3 of the 5 questions are aimed at the ministry of Jesus, and 2 are aimed at his person. So where did he get all this is the ministry. What wisdom has been given to him is the ministry. What deeds is the ministry. His person is not this the carpenter, that is his person, and the son of Mary, and then are not his brothers and sisters and all with us. Now, there are some who mention that the reason why Mark has used son of Mary is because Mark wants to stress the virgin birth. It does not seem very likely that this is the case, but this could be an interpretation. In other words, we do not mention his father. The father is not a human being. This could be, but it requires us to look too deeply into it. Now we talk about virgin birth because we know the Gospel of Luke and we know the announcement of the angel Gabriel, so we can. But before, when Mark's Gospel was written, this was not the case. And so to put down into this statement, son of Mary, virgin birth would be in pushing it a little too far. The second one, according to me, is the interpretation which Mark intends. And I'll tell you why even a little later, that Jesus was illegitimate. In other words, we know who his mother is, but we don't know who his father is. So by saying that this is the carpenter, son of Mary, they are saying we know who his mother is and not who his father is. This is also confirmed when we read Matthew's Gospel. Matthew 13, 53 to 58 has a similar scene. But because Matthew will not allow Jesus to be insulted in his Gospel, Matthew has changed Mark to, is not this the carpenter's son? So in other words, there he calls Jesus the carpenter's son. So carpenter was the male, was the father, even though he doesn't mention him, he calls him the carpenter's son. Here we know the occupation of Jesus. And notice, if Mark did not intend the townspeople response as an insult, he would have said this, is not this the carpenter's son? But he says, no, it's not just the carpenter. It's likely also Jesus took on the trade of his father. And by mentioning son of Mary, Mark wants to stress that Jesus was illegitimate. Another is that Mary was a widow for some time, and so people had possibly forgotten Joseph. Mark also never mentions the father of Jesus. Even later, we will see when we talk about those having hundredfold and being given hundredfold, he will talk about all that you will get except fathers, because Mark seems to indicate that God is Father. However, the reason why I say that I prefer the second interpretation is because of what happens in the same verse. Notice below, what Mark is telling us here is that once they said we know him, etc., they took offense at him. If this statement were not there, to hold this position that Jesus was illegitimate would have been difficult. But this statement here, took offense at him, is an indication that this is to be interpreted in a negative manner. Why would they take offense at him? What was the reason why they would reject him? What was the reason why they would say that his father? What was the reason why they make a derogatory remark? Because if you are from our hometown, then you should be at a very low level. How can you, from our small village, presume to fly so high? How can you, even though you have come from here and from this place where nothing great usually happens, how can you reach such great heights? In other words, they were unable to accept that Jesus could be so successful. In Matthew chapter 20, 1 to 16, Jesus tells a very beautiful parable. And the parable is about a landowner who goes out in the morning to hire people for his vineyard. People are hired at different times in the day, 6, 9, 12, and finally 5 in the evening, when the working day would end at 6. Now these 4 groups who are hired have to be paid at the end of the working day. And very clearly, while there are some who have worked the whole day, others have worked 3 quarters, others have worked half, and finally one group has worked for only 1 hour. Jesus, being the master storyteller that he is, could have avoided a controversy and said in the parable, those who were hired in the morning were paid, they took their wages and went. Those who were hired later in the day were paid, they took their wages and went. Those who were hired at midday were paid, they took their wages and went. And those who were hired at 5 in the evening, who worked for only 1 hour, were paid and took their wages and went. The owner of the vineyard agrees, even as he makes that contract, those who agree to the contract agree for the payment. But Jesus is a master storyteller. And so what does he do in the parable? He has the owner pay the ones who were hired at 5 in the evening and worked for only 1 hour. He pays them first. Now, we notice it's a challenge. Because those who were hired early in the morning and who had worked the whole day, when they saw the payment, made to those who were paid at 5, when they saw the payment, that is when their antenna went up. That is when the excitement began. That is when the anger began. That is when the desire began. In other words, the moment they began to look at somebody else, the moment they began to compare, they're saying, now we. Now, this is what happens here. So when Jesus says, prophets are not without honor, but except in their own hometown, among their kin, among their house, this is what it means. And Mark will make a very, very strong statement, which Matthew will change once again. See Mark's statement. Mark says, he could do no deed of power. In other words, Jesus was declared impotent. He was made impotent. He was made sterile. He simply could not do. Mark is not saying that Jesus could have done if he wanted. Very clearly, he's saying that even if Jesus wanted, he could not have done. So very clearly, basically, this is what we have to understand.